This is the lecture on frames of colorblind racism, which basically gives you an overview of Chapter 2 of Bonilla Silva's general argument in his chapter. I think one of the things that's really important to note is that for his entire book, Bonilla Silva's argument really focuses on the idea that in today's day and age, new racism practices have emerged that are more sophisticated and subtle than those typical of the Jim Crow era. In other words, in the Jim Crow era, if you remember, there were laws like separate but equal. That particularly in the South, you found that there were signs that said no, that African Americans had to sit in the back of the bus, or that that they had to drink from separate water fountains, or that they had to legally not be able to sit at the counter. And as a result, because these were codified in laws, African Americans were then criminalized for any of these actions. And so what he argues is that that form of racism is much more in your face, whereas new racism tends to be much more subtle and infused into daily life, where it doesn't necessarily even overtly talk about race. He notes on page 25 of the book that he argues that these practices are just as effective as the old ones in maintaining the racial status quo. In other words, that you have some groups, namely whites, who benefit from the privileges, while other groups like African Americans and Latinos do not. And throughout the book, he tries to trace the evolution of these new structures of racial domination to show how racial inequality is perpetuated in a colorblind world. In other words, even though we talk about, I don't see color, I'm blind to it, that even though we're saying things like colorblind, that we still have great inequalities that are very much part of society today. There are some elements of the new racial structure. And he notes on page 26 that the increasingly covert nature of racial discourse and racial practices, in other words, in today's day and age, they're much more hidden. That also today there's an avoidance of racial terminology and the ever-growing claim by whites that they experience reverse racism. So in other words, we don't like to talk about race. And you actually will hear people use that exact trope or phrase. Oh, I just don't like to talk about race. As if not mentioning race, not talking about, for example, what happened to African Americans, Latinos, Native Americans, Asians, etc., as if not mentioning it means that that there isn't inequality, and that there's the elaboration of a racial agenda over political matters that eschews direct racial references. Again, in today's day and age, part of that agenda, right, is that it tends to be dismissive. One of the current debates that sort of falls into that category is the debate between all lives matter versus Black Lives Matter. When we look at the Black Lives Matters debate, we understand that part of what that movement is trying to say is that there is something specific that is happening to African Americans, particularly as it relates to police forces. That they're being shot, targeted, profiled at a much higher rate. And these are things that you'll read about in Michelle Alexander's New Jim Crow, at higher rates than whites. And that by saying all lives matter sort of obscures the fact that there is something specific going on to a very specific community and population in the United States. He also says that what we see in today's day and age is the invisibility of most mechanisms to reproduce racial inequality. In other words, we don't understand that in today's day and age, we don't understand how certain laws have been used to disproportionately target particular communities. So, for example, there have been a number of laws, for example, in California, as well as other states throughout the country, that have passed what we call that have reinitiated what we call debtor's prison, meaning that if you fall behind particular bills, if you don't pay particular taxes, that you will automatically be put into jail. But also what these laws ignore is that disproportionately relative to the population, the census has shown that particularly Latinos, African Americans, and Native Americans tend to be disproportionately poor. So while you are purportedly putting out a class-based policy, in fact, what's happening is you're targeting very specific racial populations. And so it becomes invisible by using the idea that it's only about class. It obscures or makes invisible the fact that race matters and that it's reproducing racial inequality that has already been in existence. And Bonilla Silva also argues that there is the rearticulation of some racial practices characteristic of the Jim Crow period of race relations. We see this in terms of laws that are, in particular, we can look at Arizona that target Latinos, where you could be, where in Arizona under Jan Brewer's administration as governor, they passed a law basically saying that police could pull people over for suspicion of being illegal and here without documents. Now, when you think about being pulled over for suspicion of being undocumented, who exactly are they going to pull over? Well, what we found is that disproportionately it becomes a reason for racially profiling Latinos, regardless of their papers. And so this law unfairly sort of targets one population. And so, again, what Bonilla Silva is saying is that we are seeing laws come into existence that in some ways reproduce what we saw in Jim Crow. There are some differences between old racism and new racism, and he goes into this in chapters 2 and 3. That under old racism, it was more overt or in your face. It was built into laws overtly saying African Americans could not do this or Native Americans must do this. That here in California we had what they call the Q laws, and the Q laws were laws that were designed to target specifically Chinese Americans. So that they couldn't wear their hair a particular way, they couldn't live in particular spots, right? These are overt forms of racism. The use of slurs and derogatory statements were spoken outwardly, right? And I don't think I need to go into this, but we see this depicted in popular culture, but it was a very regular thing, right, to use slurs against different minority groups. And it's also built into the geographies of cities and towns. Like, you hear phrases like the right side of the tracks and the wrong side of the tracks. That there were particular neighborhoods that were, quote unquote, the ghetto or the hood. That these were all kind of racial and ethnic slurs directed towards different groups of people. Now, with new racism that's more covert, it's spoken secretly or using euphemisms. Euphemisms are phrases that tend to try to obscure the sort of real comments that we're trying to make. It's cloaked in microaggressions, right, which are types of statements used to put down particular groups. So, for example, you could be hanging out in a group of people, and the people will say something like, "Man, those African Americans or Latinos, fill in the blank, right? Those African Americans or Latinos, like, they're so gangster." And then they look at you and say, "But not you." So in other words, they try to separate out an individual while still characterizing in very negative ways an entire population. There's also assumed usage of race-neutral terms. So again, going back to things like all lives matter, right, is that by using race-neutral terms, it also obscures and ignores racism. So now let's focus on the central frames of colorblind racism. First, I think it's important to know that that when we talk about framing, right, it's a lot like a picture frame. What do we want people to see? Framing is the social construction of a social phenomena or event by mass media sources. It defines the packaging of an element or rhetoric to discourage certain interpretations. To encourage certain interpretation and discourage others. So again, kind of going back to this idea of a picture frame, media, gives you a very kind of select idea of what they want you to see, and it crops out all the other elements so that you don't see it. It creates a story in a very specific way. And then they use rhetoric, which is, as Bonilla Silva talks about in the chapter, this is a very persuasive or effective speaking and writing that tries to convince you of a very specific argument or idea. It utilizes a process of selective influence over perceptions of the meanings attributed to words or phrases. In other words, by word choice, also combined with sort of visual imagery, we create a narrative about specific groups of people. Framing helps us organize what we want people to perceive information. What we'll see is that there are certain themes. Like, for example, if you were to watch different news shows, you'd find, and if I asked you, one of the first things I noticed when I moved here to Sacramento a year ago is that when I watched TV, and every time they talked about South Sacramento, the news always was talking about violence, gang violence, people getting robbed, right? So the impression that I got about South Sacramento is not of the people or the community that lives there, but instead it painted South Sacramento as this extremely violent space that no one should go to. And that with framing, they try to spin a story, right? They try to create a story that you will believe or buy into. Framing also helps perpetuate specific ideologies. Ideologies are a system of ideas and ideals, a set of beliefs that affect our outlook on the world, and they are meanings in the service of power. In other words, ideology, when you think about the type of meanings that are infused into how we understand South Sacramento, they don't necessarily put South Sacramento down just for the sake of putting South Sacramento down. It actually serves a very specific purpose of disempowering the people who live there and giving more privileges to those who live in other areas. Now, when Bonilla Silva talked about frames of colorblind racism, he talked about 4 specific areas: liberalism, naturalization, cultural racism, and minimization of racism. This involves using the ideas associated with political and economic liberalism. So liberalism involves using the ideas associated with political and economic liberalism to explain racial matters. Political liberalism, e.g., for example, equal opportunity, the idea that force should not be used to achieve social policy. And then you have economic liberalism, which is choice or individualism in an abstract manner to explain racial matters. So, for example, when they talk about forms of liberalism, you hear the phrase affirmative action versus preferential treatment. Now, if you look at the history of affirmative action, what this said is that it looked at institutions and said, in the absence of diversity, race can be used as one, race and gender can be used as one of many factors that influence how you fulfill a position. Now, when we talk about preferential treatment, the narrative around affirmative action assumes that it just gives people of color or it gives women a job without regard to their qualification. The spin, right, kind of going back to the framing around that basically says that that individual achievement doesn't matter, and that people are given something for free, right? And also under liberalism, they also focus on this idea of individual choice. For example, that it doesn't look at any of the structural issues about why people may live in a particular neighborhood. So, for example, here in Sacramento, if you look right across the street from Sacramento City College, you have Land Park. Land Park historically used to have what we called, what they used to have to call racial covenants, right? In which some of the covenants basically wrote into the deeds of houses who can be who you could sell your house to and who you could not sell your houses to. And in these covenants, in terms of the deeds, they basically said that you could not sell to African Americans or Latinos or particular populations. And so, however, we don't hear about that history, right? We don't hear about why particular neighborhoods are mostly white or non-white. Also, influencing where people are able to live is also about where banks are willing to loan money. And that also historically, not just in Sacramento, but in every major city, banks used to use a redlining practice, which basically said that African Americans, Latinos, or Asians could not get loans in particular geographic areas. And yet, when we ignore that history, what we get is this idea of individual choice, that individuals choose to live in a segregated neighborhood or go or attend a segregated school, instead of actually looking at the structural issues that influence why we have so many groups, so many particular people from a particular ethnic group or racial group living in a particular area. So the idea of liberalism, right, is that it absolutely obscures the idea of institutional issues that lead to what we're seeing in terms of population dynamics. Then you have naturalization. This is a frame that allows whites to explain away racial phenomena by suggesting they are natural occurrences. So, for example, they try to basically talk about that there weren't other sort of structural issues happening, like laws that are put in place, racial covenants, policies that were put into place that segregated people. They suggest that this is sort of just a biological imperative, that it's sort of like herds of cows, right? That you essentially find a group and you stay with them, right? So, for example, you'll hear phrases like segregation is natural because we gravitate towards likeness. In other words, we just hang out with people who are more like us. While that's not necessarily untrue, it also doesn't talk about the fact that integration could easily happen, but there have been a lot of different social influences that have created separations between groups. They'll also use their phrase like, "Oh, their taste in friends or partners that are all white is just it's just the way things are." So when they look around and realize that everybody around them is all white, well, it's just how things are. I just didn't happen to make friends in this way. It doesn't look at the ways in which we're socialized to be suspicious of other people. And this happens at a very early age in almost very benign ways. So it's coded it's coded into language. It's coded into TV. So, for example, one of the stories I always tell is very early on in my childhood, my grandmother, who's Chinese, used to use phrases like hakoi and bakoi, which loosely translated are white monsters or black monsters. Part of this is, on the one hand, part of this is for her as an immigrant trying to make sense of what's going on. But historically, what she was putting forth is that for the Chinese, whites were the enemy, right? They were the ones who forced open China and helped create wars, and playing into much of the type of global racism that we've seen, that African Americans were considered evil because they were dark. And so at an early age, this is just language choice. This was infused into my life in a way that I didn't question until I was older. And this happens a lot for a lot of us. The stereotypes that we believe about groups happen before we can even interpret or question what it really means. Then we have cultural racism. This is a frame that relies on culturally based arguments. In other words, they try to find something negative about a particular ethnic group. So that's the Chinese, the Mexicans, African Americans, Native Americans, whatever it is, that they create cultural explanations for why a group is deficient, right, or less than. This frame relies on culturally based arguments. So, for example, Mexicans do not put much emphasis on education. That's why they're not achieving well in school. Blacks, quote unquote, blacks have too many babies to explain the standings of minority in societies, right? This frame utilizes a presumed biological inferiority that is based on that ethnicity. And he goes into this in pretty wide detail in the book. But this is something where they basically connect this idea of sort of biological inferiority to someone's culture. Then we have minimization of racism. This is a frame that suggests discrimination is no longer a central factor affecting minorities' life chances. Well, for example, when we're talking about race relations, someone will say, "Oh, well, as bad as things might be, it's better now than in the past." Well, it may be better now than it was in the past, but that doesn't mean racism doesn't exist, right? There is discrimination, but there's still plenty of jobs out there. In other words, it acknowledges that there's discrimination, but they're not going to do anything about it. In other words, it effectively says that racism doesn't affect people's life chances. So these are sort of the major frames that Bonilla Silva talks about, and he really sort of lays out sort of the ways in which new racism infuses these different areas.